But as soon as somebody believed in him again, it changed him. And, this was a fascinating process to me because he always wanted the big stage. He always wanted to be a legend. And when we got to Yankee Stadium and he had that chance in front of 40,000 people, he was a pro and he was the consummate performer. And I was like, okay, this is the moment of truth.
Wow.
And it really happened.
Welcome to the show, Jaime.
Thank you. Great to be here, Patrick.
So just to begin, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience, and we'll begin there.
My name is Jaime Permuth. I'm a Guatemalan photographer, longtime New Yorker. I'm currently based in Seoul, Korea. People know me best for long-form documentary projects that are interested in communities of people who live far from the mainstream, make up their own rules, live life on their own terms. I'm particularly interested in those communities. I also do other projects, such as intervening archives, historical archives that I repurpose and transform aesthetically. Different aspects of my practice, community-based projects as well. But I'm best known for long-form documentary. I lived in New York for 3 decades. So I've lived in New York longer than anywhere else. I spent a significant part of my time as an educator as well. I taught at the School of Visual Arts in the Masters in Fine Arts program in photography, and in the Master in Professional Studies in Photography, Digital Photography. I received a degree from MFA Photo. And I also taught at the New York Film Academy. So that's a little bit of my background. I'm currently based in Seoul already for 3 years.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. I like to figure out a little bit about an artist, especially a photographer, like their early upbringing. And I'm kind of curious where you come from and how you found your way into photography and art.
I come from a family of photographers. My grandmother was the first photographer, and then she taught my father when he wanted to start learning photography. And same thing with me and my brother and my sister. We all expressed an interest at some point. I basically fell into it because my cousin had a Kodak Instamatic camera, which you probably don't even know what I'm talking about, but it was the perfect machine, the perfect toy for a little boy. And it opened sideways, and it had a little flash cube that could fire 4 times before you had to switch it. It was just a beautiful little thing. And I begged my cousin to let me take a picture. And finally she gave in and let me take one picture only. I never saw the picture. I don't even remember what it was about, but just the experience of putting a frame to the world was life-changing. I mean, I don't think at that age I could have put it into words, but the act of framing helps you catalog the world, to see what's in it, to make some sense out of it. And so I begged my dad to get me a camera, and I wanted an Instamatic, and he refused. And finally he pulled out a Pentax camera from the closet, and it was complicated, had a lot of dials and settings. But he insisted on giving me that camera. So I learned to use an SLR, and just started getting deeper and deeper into that.
What was it like? Were you like, what is this? Like, what are you doing?
yeah, like, why is this so heavy? Why do I have to learn all of this stuff? The other one is so easy, just point and shoot. Um,
Those old
I left what?
Pentax were
I'm sorry.
great cameras. Those old
Yeah.
Pentax, they are great cameras. They're like little tanks. You know what I mean? They're so durable.
Exactly.
That's a interesting first one to learn. So
yeah. I mean, I started shooting early and kept on shooting, and then I left Guatemala to study in Jerusalem to study psychology and English literature, and I continued taking pictures. And I had my first exhibitions in Israel, first publications in Israel, and then I decided that I wanted to go to New York. So I applied to the Masters in Fine Arts, Photography-related media at the School of Visual Arts, and they accepted me. So I went to New York, fell in love with the city, stayed, built a career when it was still analog, and then 15 years into my career, I went back for another master's degree in photography, also from the School of Visual Arts, in the Master's in Professional Studies in Digital Photography. And when I completed that, I started teaching in the program as well. And 30 years in New York, a whole lot to say, many incredible experiences, without 4 hours.
There's a lot of great photography that comes out of there. And I'm kind of curious about Grandma. In her early work, you said she was the first photographer. And what was she shooting on, and what was she shooting? How did she get started? I'm curious.
She was born in Poland, but was raised in Switzerland, and she went to a private lyceum in Switzerland. My grandfather went to Guatemala to look for opportunities to build a life in Guatemala, because he heard that other Jewish relatives had been successful, and he at some point sent for the family. And so my grandmother arrived in Guatemala when she was 15, and she started shooting the life, not even in Guatemala City. And to be honest with you, I don't even know how she got film or had it processed, because when I was growing up in Guatemala so many years later, we still had to ask people who went to the United States to bring back a brick of black and white and a brick of color for us. It was hard to get the supplies, and she didn't even live in Guatemala City. So somehow she was able to shoot the life of the villages around the town where she lived, portraits of the family, a few self-portraits. She never thought of herself as a photographer, but she was talented.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Did you look through those as a kid? Did you look through those images?
I really looked at those images after a long kind of self-imposed exile. I was away from everything, from the country, from my family, from everything, for about 10 years. And when I returned to Guatemala, one of the first things that I did was go back to the family albums to try and get a better sense of things that I'd been thinking about during those years. And that's when I kind of rediscovered her work, already with a trained eye, already being a photographer. I was amazed by it. I mean, I opened a...
Wow. Yeah.
It blew my mind. Patrick, I couldn't believe the pictures that I was looking at. And I even asked my dad, I said, whose photographs are these? And he looked at me like I was so naive or hopelessly clueless. And he said, your grandmother. I never knew, but she was very private. I never even knew that she had taken photographs so seriously. I mean, when I would show her my photographs growing up, she would say, "That's a good one," or "Not this, not this, not this. That's a good one." And she would never go further than that. She would just kind of like, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Um, and I had no idea. Of course, she had already passed away when I realized that, and I have so many questions that I would love to ask of her, but that's not an option anymore. So I look at the photographs and try to find my own answers.
So your father was then a photographer as well, you said?
But not by profession. My father was a lawyer, a high-profile lawyer. So are my brother and my sister. I'm the black sheep of the family who, like failed to be a lawyer. I never pursued it. I didn't go into the family business. Instead, I chose to make photography my life instead of a part-time activity. I mean, my father and my brother take it very seriously as well, but they're lawyers. I mean, that's where they spent the bulk of their life was in their legal practice, and I spent the bulk of my life making photographs.
That's amazing. So that, I think that's really, really interesting. So you have this like line of photographers in your family. Do you think that kind of, you get into archives, do you think that got you interested in diving into archives, is kind of diving into your own?
Definitely. I mean, that was a starting point just to realize the mystery of family life, right? The things we don't say to each other, the things we don't know about each other, and how a grandparent can be reduced to a few anecdotes, and a life can be just kind of like boiled down to a few stories that you share with other people and not a real person. When I started coming back to Guatemala, I actually did a project that was an intervention of a historic archive, and I entitled it Archive for an Imaginary City. And it was all about exile and how memory fails completely, in so many ways. Things that you remember vividly and never happened, things that you remember only vaguely and were incredibly important, things that happened before your time but set the stage for your own life and circumstance. So the first project that I did in Guatemala was actually an archive for somebody who left. And it was the first time that I worked in a historic archive, and they were actually really strict. You weren't allowed to crop the images. You weren't allowed to transform them aesthetically. So what I did is I made a very personal selection of images and paired them with fragments of literary texts or poetry or radio bulletins or newspaper articles to create a conversation that reflected, my fears, my desires, my questions about my own country and where I had come from. And it was limited. What I could do artistically was limited, but it was still very important for me. And some of the later projects that I did in Guatemala, I can trace back to that imaginary archive because it's a kind of blueprint for themes that matter to me as a Guatemalan who left the country, and trying to understand why it was necessary for me to leave or inevitable for me to leave.
I'm kind of curious. Why did you, why did you why did you go out there? What were you looking for? Why did you leave?
Well, I grew up during the Civil War in Guatemala, and it's not an idyllic childhood in any way. And there was a climate of self-censorship, which was necessary for survival. I mean, if you said the wrong thing to the wrong person, your entire family could pay the price for that. It was very repressive and it was dangerous. I'm an expert marksman. I grew up with martial arts and boxing, and just because that was the country that I was living in, and I wanted something more. I wanted more freedom. I wanted to leave that kind of toxic environment and just have a chance to expand my horizons and to experience different things. So I got a scholarship from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I took it, and I spent the next 6 years in Israel, in Jerusalem and then in Tel Aviv, before leaving for New York.
What was that like for you? What was that like for you?
It was fascinating. I mean, Jerusalem is a very polemic place. People have very strong opinions. And that actually makes for very lively debates. Again, this is one of those things where I could keep you here for hours telling you about what it's like to come from Guatemala and arrive in Jerusalem.
It's a long-form podcast. We can do it. You can at least,
indeed,
maybe the clip
I would
notes,
say,
but yeah.
Let's just leave it at that.
Fair enough. I think that's interesting. It seems like you found your way into art there. What was it about the arts that pulled you in? You said you had a family that was in that were lawyers, and they kind of have a family business in that, and now you're in the art. What was it? Was it there that you found it?
Yes.
What was it that pulled you in?
The plan. You asked too many good questions, Patrick. I mean, it's your fault if you Secretary DM.
Well, it makes a lot of sense when we get to see your work later. All these little buttons, all these things are going to connect because you have such a great eye and a great perspective and such care. And so, I think this origin story is really, really important. So I'm kind of curious, what was it about? What did you find there about the arts here that pulled you in?
What derailed my train, because according to my family's plan, if I wasn't going to be a lawyer, then a psychologist was a pretty good second option, respectable, earn a living. That was okay with my parents. But aside from learning psychology, I was also learning literature, and literature really just took me away. That's where I got fascinated by art and storytelling. And to this day, my documentary style is most influenced by techniques that I borrow from fiction. So I tell nonfiction stories using fictional devices, and for the first series that we're going to talk about today, Yonkeros, the first image in what became the book is a view of the main street where the story takes place, and it's a kind of foreshadowing of everything that is going to come. That first image, that when you open the book to that first image, if you look carefully, a lot of the themes that are going to be developing during the book are contained, hinted at, signaled in that first image. And that's a device that I learned in literature. it's called foreshadowing technically.
Yeah.
So literature really was the reason why I got interested in art. I started researching art aside from my literature classes and trying to exhibit my work. I had a couple of things that were ready to be shown, and it was because of that experience of sitting in a classroom discussing texts with other adults. I mean, in a way, if you just walk into that room, it seems so pointless. I mean, what are they talking about? Sentence structure and story. I mean, don't they have something real that they need to be doing with their time? How can anybody discuss books for hours and hours and hours? But that completely opened my world to the possibility of being an artist.
Wow. Well, this leads me to my next question. What is your some of these books that were really kind of intriguing you
at the time?
Yeah, or now. It doesn't matter. It sounds like literature is something that is really important to you. Reading, research. What are you reading?
Yes. When I studied literature, I got this kind of like literature 101 in college, right? So the Greeks and particularly the tragedies, the Greek tragedies and comedies, and this.
I spend a lot of time in the Greeks. Yeah, I do. Okay. Yeah, I read Marcus Aurelius, but he's Roman. But I read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations all the time, and he references like Seneca and some of these other ones, and I love that stuff. I love it.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly, and that's the foundation of all of Western literature in a way. So. I got a very good education literature in Jerusalem. Always be grateful for that. These days, I love to, if I'm gonna, like engage in a new project somewhere, if I'm gonna travel, I try to find literature of that place. And you know what? Especially, I read a lot of hard-boiled fiction, a lot of detective stories, because I find that they give you the sense of the street so strongly, the sense of the popular mindset, the culture, the dialogues. It's amazing, how that takes me to a place even before I arrive there. And of course, that's not what I studied in the classroom in Israel, but that's one of my favorite things is to soak up the street level feeling of a city before I arrive, whether it's Havana or Mexico City or Guatemala City. That's my shortcut.
That is actually a really good tip. Especially if you're doing preliminary research. I'd never thought about going in that direction.
It's a lot of...
That's fascinating. What do you discover? Is it just... Do you just find like tall tales? Or I don't know. What do you find in there that like pulls out some kind of interest? That's interesting research.
Yeah, I mean, detectives, they have to observe, right? That's what a detective does. They have to carefully observe every detail of a scene. They're also experts in questioning and the dialogues, what people are holding back, the way they express themselves, the places they go to, depending on their social milieu, their social hierarchy. It's all really revealing. And some of these, especially in Latin America, some of these police procedurals or hard-boiled detective stories are also very political. So that they really get into the the kind of seamier, but very authentic side of these societies. I find it fascinating, and
it is fascinating.
Yeah, it's
you know,
much
what's yeah, it's true. And I you know, some of the reason why those books, some of the best ones are so good is because they're so close to what's real, but it's a story told within a kind of perceived reality. And I think the best ones kind of like bite around the edges of truth to a certain degree, or some kind of idea of truth that is actually relevant and the nonfiction world, you know. And so that is a fascinating twist there. Wow, that's great. That is really good. My next question is I think there is always someone that is significant in the development of a career. Was there someone that was really important for you in your early development that kind of was like a great person that pushed it? Could be an author, it could be a teacher, it could be a mentor. Was there someone that was vital for your development into being a photographer?
I would say, you know, in Guatemala, we didn't have photography schools.
Yeah.
We learned from each other, from other photographers. We learned from books. I was fortunate that my dad had some great photography books at home. So that was my education. Like my first coup de coeur, you know, my first crush photographically was Robert Capa. And that's because as a kid, I was fascinated by war. And so I would look at war books. And all of a sudden I found a Robert Capa book and I started looking at it as photographs. So, you know, I was looking at these photographs and going like, oh my God, you know, like this is just incredible the way this guy captures the stories of wartime. I mean, the other books that I had were more like encyclopedic about it. This is a Panzer tank. It served, you know, it was used in North Africa, and this is General Rommel, and this is, you know, his British counterpart, Montgomery. But Robert Capa, I mean, the Dying Legionnaire, and these were on a completely different realm. So Robert Capa was my first love. There was a book of Cartier-Bresson at home that blew me away. For me, he was just God. I mean, I couldn't even understand that those were photographs, that anybody could shoot a photograph like that. Kertész, Brandt. But my greatest influence was Manuel Alvarez Bravo, the Mexican photographer. And he liked to pair photographs with titles. And that language was a bridge. Octavio Paz, the Mexican poet, did a collaborative book with Manuel Alvarez Bravo called Instante y Revelación, Instant and Revelation. And he contributed texts and, you know, short paragraphs of thought to Alvarez's photographs. And at one point he says, Manuel, he has a picture of a wooden horse in a Mexican market somewhere. He says, Manuel, lend me your little horse to take me to the other side of this side. And that's what Alvarez Bravo did for me. He would show me a picture and then he would title it in a way that left me kind of helpless. What just happened? What? And I would have to come back to that picture. I was probably 14, 15, and until it was illuminated by the words, until I understood the mechanism, the poetic mechanism at work. He was looking at something, but his intention was to represent it as something else than what was visible. And Manuel Alvarez Bravo is an exquisite photographer anyway. But I would consider him my greatest teacher. When I went to New York and I completed my studies, the next step was to work for photographers. And I was lucky to be in New York, and some of the photographers I admired the most were already there in that city. So I took a job printing for Patrick de Marchelier, a fashion photographer, whose work I really loved. I printed for Lois Greenfield, who was the premier dance photographer at that point. And then I went to work for Gilles Perez, the Magnum photographer. I printed for him his books and exhibitions for a few years as well. Rosalind Solomon. I mean, incredible people until I had enough. I mean, like, I didn't want to be printing somebody else's work anymore. I just wanted to do my own thing. But that was quite an education. Aside from, the master's degree from SVA, which also put me in touch with some incredible people, I wouldn't say that that any of those photographers were mentors to me, but I learned a great deal from them. I mean, nobody sort of like took me under their wing and said, I'm going to help you advance, in this crazy industry.
I'm going to pass you everything I know. Yeah, no.
You're right. You're my right.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, nothing like that. But I learned so many valuable lessons from just working for other photographers.
You said something right there that I think I'm going to not forget. It's taking me to the other side of this side. Take me to the other side of this side.
Octavio Paz.
That is just, that is something. That is something. Do you feel like you try to do that with your work now?
Yes. Does
that blur the lines with documentary? Because you keep calling yourself documentary.
Well, I would say I work like to echo Walker Evans, not to compare myself in any way to Walker Evans, just to echo his words. I work in a documentary style.
Gotcha.
I am a documentary photographer, but I work in a documentary style. And I do take liberties, but where I was really going with that is photography is a different truth than logic or than intellectual analysis can give you. Photography operates in a different way, and so photographs happen, right? You're in the moment, and you engage with that moment, and you create something, you construct something. Perhaps there's part intuition, part immediate response, part deliberate artistic intention. But it's not something that you want to propose in such a direct way. I mean, over time, the photographs start amounting to something. They start generating some kind of gravitas. But I let light and shadow and intuition, the visual world, I respond to the visual world as a photographer, and then that becomes a story, as opposed to me trying to coerce it into a certain shape. So, I think it's important to do research, to know something about the context of the subject that interests you, the subject at hand. But it's also equally important to just be really, really comfortable with technique so that you don't have to think about it, and to respond photographically to the situation, and trust that it's going to tell you something, that you will find a visual truth, a poetic truth that is beyond language, written language, verbal language.
You just dropped so much brilliance right there, and I think that is a great way to transition to Yonkeros. So let's take a look at some of your work. It's I think what you just said right there is going to translate into what we're going to see next. And so let's go ahead and share our screen, and let's take a look. All right.
All right. So, Yonkeros was published in 2013 as a monograph by La Fábrica Editorial in Madrid, and that was my first monograph as such. I shot it during a year in a very little-known enclave of New York City called Willets Point, Queens. Which is a short train ride away from Grand Central Station. So 45 minutes away from New York City, from Manhattan, you have this landscape. And Willets Point is also known as the Iron Triangle, and it used to be, because it's bulldozed over now, for the most part. It used to be the home to the scrap metal businesses and junkyards of New York City, mostly run by Latinos, particularly Mexicans and Ecuadorians. So I spent a year documenting this place, the landscape, the working lives, the clients, and I gave myself a year because I wanted to see how the seasons not only changed the landscape but affected the working conditions. What it means to work in the brutal heat of the summer, and what it's like to touch metal and have your fingertips freeze off and get glued to it. I mean, like, coming from Latin America, I was fascinated by this place, by the people who work there and their often checkered stories, right? So this is the main street all the way back. You see a Pepsi Cola sign, and then behind that you see the bleachers of Citi Field Stadium, the old Shea Stadium where the Mets play baseball. And that stadium is the reason that Willets Point had to go away, because the city invested close to $1 billion to renovate that into a shining sports palace. And the last thing that then Mayor Bloomberg wanted across the street was the junkyards. And so Willets Point works on many levels. One of them is the city itself, and how New York City was evolving at the time. Let me see if I can scroll through, or if I'm not scrolling through. Like I said, most of the mechanics come from Latin America. Their life stories are complicated. They're not trained to be mechanics necessarily. They learn there in Willets Point. And there's so many stories to tell, of course. I shot about 15,000 pictures for the project, and about 100 something make it into the book, right? So it's important to be very careful with the editing. I favor the kind of surrealist style in the storytelling, like this picture of an airplane over the standstill of the cars. Of course, they're not moving; they're just blocking the street. And LaGuardia sits off to the side from Willets Point, So there's airplanes coming down all the time. Every few minutes, there's another airplane descending or rising. And yet, there's maybe 3 pictures with airplanes in the book. This is one of them. And why would I choose this one? Well, because the moment is so unusual, right? I mean, we all know that airplanes don't come down on the wire; they don't slide down to land on an electric wire. And there's something about the stillness of the cars and the scale of the airplane that makes you question time. The same way that you arrive in Willets Point and you see a landscape that looks like a lunar landscape, full of craters and mud, and so the whole experience of Willets Point had a lot to do with questioning your perceptions. So that's part of what I'm trying to do here.
This image, it literally looks like that airplane is on a zip line, and it's a toy airplane. It doesn't actually look like a real one. And I can definitely see that. Why did you choose black and white for this series?
Actually, the book has color as well.
It does?
But I started in black and white because it's my first love. I absolutely prefer black and white. I like the aesthetic distance. I like the way it simplifies by eliminating the color content. So there's a drama in black and white that I favor. But eventually, I was actually forced to embrace color, and I don't know if we can get to that today, but when you do a photographic project, you kind of make up your own rules, but then you have to live by them. And I'm really jumping ahead here. But the moment that I arrived in Willets Point, I knew that the days were numbered, even though the mechanics had survived for about 40 years in their fight against New York City that wanted to evict them from day one. And they couldn't see that the end was around the corner, but I could see it because I was an outsider. So I had one ending figured out for the book. I went to Willets Point a few days before Christmas, and there was this incredible snowstorm that froze the trains on their tracks, and it was almost impossible to get out there. And when I finally got out there, it was surreal. Everything had come to a standstill, and I thought I would end the book on that note. And it was all black and white up until then. But then 2 weeks later, this apocalyptic ending didn't make sense because there was a second snowstorm. And I decided to go out and wait for the sunrise. And so I stood in the snow from around 4 o'clock in the morning until 5:30. And the sunrise was beautiful. And so it was all pastel colors over the snow. And I realized I had to incorporate color at that point to be able to do it justice. So then fortunately, we shoot digital. We have a raw file, and even though I had interpreted all the files as black and white images, I could go back to some of them and make them color, right? So I did, because you can't end the book with 10 pages of color after it's been black and white the whole way. And that forced me to reimagine the whole book at that point in time. And the book is a mix of black and white and color, but there's a good reason for it.
Well, it makes sense, and you have a very powerful black and white. I love the contrast, and the detail you're able to pull out, and you're using portraits in such a really powerful way. Can you talk about why you felt it was important to include portraits? Because you could focus on the place or whatever. And it seems like you're telling a whole entire story here of the people and the place and so I'm kind of curious how you're using the portrait.
Yeah, as we were talking earlier today, the photography is not created in a vacuum. It responds to your individual quest, if you want to call it, the kind of answers that you want from life. And so I was fascinated in the people who worked in Willets Point, these Latin Americans that reminded me so much of home in so many ways. Working in this landscape that was more like the third world than the first world, their particular ways of running the business, because you won't see a single computer, and yet there is a very exacting inventory of everything in Willets Point. But everything is annotated with a grease pencil, and it's, kept track of in ledgers, old school. The mechanics, they improvise solutions to everything. And in that sense, it's very artisanal. Things are created out of nothing, with blow torches and hammers, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful opposition of, let's say, third world ingenuity and survivalist strategies against first world consumerism and obsolescence. And who's responsible for that? It's the people. It's the mechanics who work there.
We have those from where I'm from, and I didn't grow up a very rich person at all. And so, like, one of the things you would do is you'd go to those junkyards if you wanted to fix your car and you wanted to find one of those things, and you'd go out there and pull the part off yourself. And then you could pay a little extra to have them do it if you wanted, so it seems this is calling up a part of where I came from. And I was kind of curious about that. Were they welcoming of you? Were you welcomed? Did you become a part of their family? How did that relationship start and form over the year that you spent there?
Which image do you have on the screen right now? Do you have the man with the crucifixes on his back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, the first day that I came to Willets Point, what I did was just walk around and talk to people all day. I had my camera visible on my chest, over my shoulder, etc. But I didn't take a picture the entire day. I just talked to people and kind of gauged how I was accepted. Of course, I speak Spanish, and that's incredibly important to communicate in Spanish. And I just hung out. And if they weren't too busy, then they could do a little chit chat with me, and I would circle back and wave and whatever. Towards the end of the day, I shot a few pictures. Let me see. Hold on a second. Just a moment. Let me see if I have one of those. Oh, okay. I found one. Are you seeing the car?
Yeah.
Floating over a fence?
Yeah.
That's from the first day of shooting. I shot about maybe 12 or 13 of these. Every car impacted in a different way, crushed in a different way, and they seem to be floating in thin air, right? So the whole thing was so fascinating to me visually. The mystery of, putting together the circumstances of the crash. Of course, there's, other cars piled below those cars. But when I got home, and I'm very impatient, so I immediately downloaded the image and started looking through them. I was like, okay, I'm definitely gonna go back. There was enough there, for me to go back. And over time, I started getting to know these people, these mechanics, and every time I would photograph them, I would bring back pictures. This guy, for example, this was the third time I photographed him. And the first two times, I thought the portraits were strong, but they were not the truth. So, not that there is one truth, of course, but aesthetically, it was not exactly what I was hoping for. And months went by, and I started photographing him in winter, and then the weather got hot enough that he was wearing a tank top, and I could see part of the tattoos on his body. And by that point, he really knew me. We had met a number of times. I had photographed him a number of times, and each time he was more trusting. And then this is where, let's say, I depart from strict documentary practice. I said to him, can you take off your shirt? I want to look at the rest of your tattoos. And ink on the body is a kind of biography, if you know how to read it, if you're paying attention. And some of the tattoos are older and more faded, and some of them are half finished, sometimes on people, and that's all significant. There's a chronology here. Like the satanic-looking tattoos are older than the head of Jesus Christ. The bulldog with the knife through its teeth, the kind of poisonous-looking salamander. All the way on top is the name of his mother, and all the way on the bottom, it says, "Forgive me, mother." And he explained to me that he got that tattoo first, before he committed the crime, because he might not have a chance to apologize to his mother and beg her for her forgiveness. And it's like a capsule of his life on his back. And I was fascinated. From day one, I was fascinated by his heavy silver jewelry, which is a very Puerto Rican thing. And so I asked him to flip back the crucifixes so that I could have them in the shot as well. And, this is where I'm bending documentary practice to my own needs. My need is to zero in on the poetry of the thing. For me, this became like an altar, like a Baroque church altar that is found in so many Latin American churches. Such a density of information, such a richness visually. And that made the photograph what it is. Somebody might be upset by that. I could never submit a photograph like this to, let's say, a world press competition or something like that. This is not news. It's documentary, but it's a lyrical documentary. I'm stepping in. I'm taking liberties, trying to get to the powerful image. And so
I think you did a masterful job of explaining the difference. That is, you're exactly right. This also shows their comfort with you. It shows a connection that you have with them, and it's wonderful. I love the contrast. You are using your tools very, very effectively. And so the story behind this image is really, really strong.
Yeah, it was a really fascinating year. And, of course, a lot more work on my website, but I wanted to give you a just a taste of Yonkeros and the kind of reality that was there for me working in Willets Point.
What's amazing too is that it no longer exists, and those people are no longer there. And so you captured kind of the final moments, and that also makes the series, and you turned it into a book.
Yeah, exactly. And the book opened a lot of doors for me, and that's, if we talk, let's say, career and being a professional, not every project deserves a book, but some projects really do. And if you put your passion behind it, your best effort behind it, it's incredible to hold it in your hands. And it's opened so many doors. It's led me to teach workshops in different countries, give artist talks, have exhibitions internationally. It got me my faculty job at the School of Visual Arts. And I had a chance to collaborate with one of my favorite writers, Francisco Goldman, who wrote the most beautiful title essay for the book, where he compares Willets Point to the lost city of Atlantis, fathoms deep, lost fathoms deep. And the book is many, many things, but it's amazing how Francisco was able to feel that kind of mythical thing that I was trying to get at. Someday this is going to be urban legend, right? Right now the ground is still too toxic from 40 years of fuel and waste being dumped into Willets Point. New York City hasn't been able to clean it enough that they can start building. But someday, yes, that will be one of those, high-rise, high-end neighborhoods because of the views of Manhattan. And people will never believe that once upon a time it was all junkyards. It will be amazing, 20, 30 years down the line to see these photographs and place them geographically where the high rises are, where the fancy restaurants and the boutiques and all of that are going to spring.
It would be great to do an art installation. So I'm sure someone would use this as an idea later. So here's a freebie for you to do an installation on the ground floor of one of those buildings, of junk cars and stuff like that, and bring you into that. I think you did a great job. In my opinion, this is just me speaking, bringing you into one of these places. They do seem like you're transported to another world. It's almost dystopian, but organized. It's so
well said.
Interesting.
Well,
yeah. And the way you described it, it reminds me of my old days. I used to go out there and go in and pull parts off cars and help people fix cars and stuff. I've got an old history, and working wrenches and stuff like that. So it was a very cool series for me. So we can move on to the next series, if you would like, which is a series of diptychs, and we can kind of take a look at that. Is that book still available, or was it like a limited run?
Yonkeros?
Yeah.
There's still a few copies, not many left, but there's still a few copies. I think on Amazon you might find a copy.
So I'm sure after the description that you just gave, I'm sure after the description you just gave, and it's going to be sold out soon. So that is a great series. So let's jump into the next one.
Yeah. The next project that I want to share with you is The Street Becomes. That's book that was awarded by Urbanaut in 2020 and published by Meteoro Editions in Amsterdam in 2021. But it's a project that actually started much earlier than that in 2014 when I was an artist in residence at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. And it just took a long time to fully realize itself into a book form. The theme of the project is the urban street and how it changes in times of war and peace. And all the words in the book come from archives of photographs, some of them institutional and some of them private. I represent war and peace arbitrarily. So war is the U.S. Marine Corps photographs of American interventions, military interventions in regions of the Caribbean and Central America in the beginning of the 20th century and the middle of the 20th century. And then peace is something called the Latino Festival in Washington, D.C. during the late 1970s and 1980s. Now, why I chose those two bodies of work to represent war and peace has to do with the residence itself at the Smithsonian. And if that is of interest, I can tell you a little bit about that as well.
Of course.
I was nominated for this opportunity, and then as a nominated artist, I had to come up with a proposal. The Smithsonian is huge. It's 21 museums under the umbrella of that one institution. And it's truly Byzantine. Nobody at one museum knows what's in the other museum. You can't. There's so much. There's just hundreds of thousands of items at the Smithsonian. Some of them are digitized, some are not. Some
they
of
range
them
from all kinds of subjects too. So it's
absolutely
it's a massive. Yeah, that I've been to the Smithsonian. I've only been to 5 of them, but it still felt like it was so many.
It's mind-boggling. I had this opportunity to do a research project. That's what the grant called for, the fellowship called for, but the possibilities were endless. So to narrow them down, I took as my starting point the fact that I'm Guatemalan, and different cities across the United States have different kinds of Latino populations. So, for example, Houston, where you're from, very Mexican. Same with Chicago. But if you go to New York is very Puerto Rican, very Dominican. If you go to Miami, it's very diverse, but there's very important Cuban population there that is powerful. If you go to Washington, D.C., Central Americans rule. And so when I had this opportunity, I thought to myself, well, this is something that I've always wanted to explore, the Central American community in Washington, D.C. But where would I start? At the Smithsonian. And I started making trips to Washington to meet with different curators at different institutions to try and figure out what they had, what kind of materials they had, and could they potentially be a partner in this process. What I learned after a couple of months of conversations and trips to Washington, D.C., was that from all of the museums at the Smithsonian, there is only one museum that looks inwards. Washington, D.C. is not a state. And the Smithsonian is a national institution. So all of these museums kind of look outwards, but there is one museum that is separate, that sits across the river, not on the mall, not where all the museums are, across the river. And that's the Anacostia Community Museum. That's the precursor to what is now the National African American History and Culture Museum. Before there was that museum, there was the Anacostia, and that was the African American Museum. Now, the Anacostia actually had materials about the Latino community in DC, particularly the Afro-Caribbean aspect of that community. And so, sure enough, I started by visiting the archives at Anacostia, still at the proposal level, still hammering out my proposal, not yet having received the fellowship. And I found some materials from a landmark exhibition entitled Our Black Mosaic. Some materials that had been left behind, maybe by a bureaucratic glitch. Just a few things that really piqued my interest. There were a couple of contact sheets by a photographer named Nancy Shia that showed the Latino Festival. And at that point, I didn't know that such a thing existed. But the images showed people coming out to celebrate their Latino identity on the streets of Washington, D.C., selling food, dancing, wearing costumes, etc. Then the other thing that I found, which was incredibly surprising to me, were some photocopies, not even actual prints, just photocopies of images of the U.S. Marine Corps at the beginning of the 20th century, occupying Santo Domingo and Haiti. Just a few shots, 8 or 10 shots of Marines, taking aim behind a picket fence or storming what looked like makeshift huts on an urban street. And I was actually fascinated by those two kinds of visuals. And I created this project called The Street Becomes that weaves them together. Of course, it's arbitrary, right? This is something that I set up, this dialogue between these images. So, I mean,
what it like? You kind of got into the inspiration a little bit, but what? How do you? I'm trying to kind of connect it to. Did you feel drawn to this like initially, or just like this topic was like so rich for your own discovery? I'm just seeing you going through your grandma's album, discovering images, and I feel like you're kind of doing the same thing here, and it inspired something.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started picking at that imagery and really poring over those two contact sheets. I understood that there were things that were happening on the periphery of the Latino Festival that were interesting, like the image on screen right now, where you see a cop in the middle of the crowd, busy talking on his walkie-talkie, right? I mean, he's moving with the crowd, but there's a tension there. And I caught a couple of other images where I spotted maybe a banner from the FSLN, the Sandinista Front for Liberation, at a time when, like the Contras were fighting in Nicaragua. And then all of a sudden you have this banner raised in the nation's capital. And I was like, how can this be happening? Like, okay, there are people buying empanadas and selling tacos and dancing, but there's also this happening on the edges, away from the center. There's something else happening here. What exactly is being contested here on the streets of Washington, D.C.? And like I said, there were only a few images at the Anacostia, and the same thing with the Marine Corps. So where did these images come from? I eventually tracked those to the National Archives in Maryland. So most of my Smithsonian fellowship, I actually spent outside the Smithsonian at the National Archives in Maryland, digging through all of those images from the U.S. Marine Corps, and then knocking on the doors of private homes, such as Nancy Shea or Rick Reinhardt or other photographers from D.C. who happened to have taken an interest in the Latino Festival. And so I would knock on their door and introduce myself and say that I was interested in their archives for my project. And it was quite a big ask, to be honest, Patrick, because I'm like a stranger to them, and I'm asking to go through their images, and if they haven't been digitized, to sit with them for days, scanning them and digitizing them. And I had to explain to them that I would use the images in an autonomous project and that I would transform them aesthetically in ways that were necessary for the project, and that they had to allow me to exhibit them and even to sell them and to publish them if I had the opportunity to publish a book. It was a big ask. Lucky for me, the people that took an interest in the Latino Festival were generous-hearted. I mean, they were either living in the neighborhood or had a connection to the neighborhood where the Latino Festival took place, Mount Pleasant. And so I started building this project. Difficult visually, and I'll show you some more images. Difficult visually because the U.S. Marine Corps stuff was shot with large format cameras, 8x10, 5x7, 4x5 formats at the beginning of the 20th century, or sometimes in the middle, if it's the Republican Dominican was occupied also in the middle of the century. But the Latino Festival images are snapshots in color, 35 millimeter. And you know that if you're going to make this work, they have to flow. So I had to transform them aesthetically, and that involved, number one, bringing them into monochrome, bringing all of the work into monochrome, and then a series of steps, analog to digital, to downgrade the image quality, particularly attacking the midtones, so that the reading of the images was a little bit slower and more complicated, so that it was perhaps more gestural. And this is kind of the way the book works as diptychs, so that war has a warm sepia tone and peace has a cool gray tone, and that helps differentiate them. And I'm trying to sort of like suggest new meanings for the street in times of war, in times of peace. Maybe this is a good example, a group of Marines parading in Haiti with their regimental banners. And then on the other side, Afro-Caribbean man holding his daughter up like she was his banner in the nation's capital. And what exactly is being said, right? How is the street transformed? Even the context. These are some of the issues that I'm exploring. Some of it is gestural. Some of it is just juxtaposition. There's so much to say, and I don't want to, spend all of our time actually discussing images. an image like this, I will comment on just to illuminate what I'm trying to do here a little bit further. The man who is being detained on the street on the left and being forced to strip down in a public space. If you look at the man on the right side and his dance, there's a symmetry there, and Latin American dance actually contains a lot of history in it. There's a Colombian dance, for example, where the man drags his foot behind him as he dances, slowly drags his foot. That's about jail time. And so this is where I'm bringing these two very disparate visuals into a collision or a dialogue with each other, and leaving it open-ended so that people can take away whatever they will from that dialogue.
I have a question for you. What was it like to switch to interpreting other people's images or other photographs that you didn't necessarily take? There's something I read that was like photography happens in 2 edits, and I might be getting this wrong, so someone will probably comment down below and make sure you tell me. But the first edit's when you take the image, right? You're selecting and framing it and providing a perspective, and then later, when you get all those images, you start to make a selection from those to kind of tell a story. That's the second. And here, you're going in on that second edit, and you're going in with a different. What was it like to do that when you've been photographing for so long?
Definitely. Okay. The title essay for the book actually struggles with some of those questions, and it's a conversation between myself and Olivia Cadaval, who was the head of the Folk Art Museum at the Smithsonian, a woman who is an ethnographer and has written extensively about the Latino Festival. And so, our conversation is the title essay. So what is the use of an archive from an academic's point of view or from an artist's point of view? What does it mean if you're an academic, and what's the first thing you try to do with the photographs, and what is the first thing you try to do with the photographs if you're an artist? So I would encounter the photographs and let them speak to me as photographs. Like, what am I getting from this image? What is the light and the shadow and the composition and the texture making me feel? What am I getting lyrically from these photographs? An academic would first try to build a context, right? Where was it taken? Who's in it? What was the historical moment? What's happening in the days or weeks or years previous and after this photograph? Create a factual context for this, right? I'm just trying to pull in the images that really speak to me as visual objects. And there were so many, and it was such a thrill to try to inhabit a time and place that was not available to me, but nevertheless, I felt it was urgent for me to understand. I could have been a Guatemalan leaving my country for Washington, D.C. in the late 70s, running away from the Civil War and trying to build a new life in Washington, D.C. That was not my story. It could have been. So I was fascinated by the fact of this community in a place like Washington, D.C. And, it's a very interesting moment when the Latino Festival starts happening, because the motivation to organize the festival is that somebody did a census of the Latino community and they were grossly underrepresented. The government did a census and the numbers were ridiculously low. So the Latino community was like, this is not us. I mean, we're way more than 17,000 in Washington, D.C. That's not true. So how do we become visible? And some of these Latinos of Afro-Caribbean descent had already been involved in the struggle for equal rights in the African-American community. So they knew the importance of the street. And they knew that a show of numbers meant a show of force and meant that you had to be recognized with, a force to be reckoned with. And that's the impetus to go out on the street. So it's a manner of celebrating your identity, but in a deeper way, it's a manner of creating that identity, because that identity doesn't exist in the public eye. You're invisible. So how do you become visible? And there's all kinds of things you can say about from all kinds of points of view if you go to the archive. So let's say, do you see the diptych on the screen right now? The man wearing a formal jacket and a bow tie.
Yeah.
I did not research this image to find out the specifics of it. What drew me to this image is that this man, and I believe is happening in Haiti, the beginning of the 20th century, is surrounded by military brass, American military brass, and he's not American. And so to me, visually, this is like a ventriloquist and their puppet. Even the cuffs of his shirt, the way they look visually like shackles. I mean, this whole thing to me is about putting somebody in power but controlling them. Visually, this is purely visual, and this is the level that I am interested in. This is the truth of the image to me, is this a puppet? As an artist, I'm not talking here about the historical truth of this image. On the other side of the page is a guy who's wearing a shirt that says Pepe el Jefe, Pepe the Chief. The chief of what? Like, what exactly does he command? He seems to be kind of a little bit anxious or bored and absolutely alone in the frame, but he's wearing that shirt. So who gave him the shirt? Is it a family joke? Is he really the chief of something? Does he have power? What kind of power does he wield? And if you ask Olivia the same question, she will tell you that this is Pedro Luján, a Peruvian man who was incredibly important to the Latino community in the 80s and organized these Latino festivals. And yes, he was a powerful motor for his community, right? I don't know that, but I'm fascinated by the image and the question that it raised next to the other image. What is the true nature of power, and how does that change the street, or how does the street allow for it to exist?
That is just, and the backstory, your interpretation of them is really, really interesting in the way you have him looking at, and I'm going to use your words here, the puppet, and yeah. He's claiming himself to be El Jefe by his shirt, but he's looking at, the installed leader. That is incredibly powerful. You have a great way of lining up these images to where they're you can tell they're not from the same time or the same place, but they're talking to each other in such a unique way. I think this series is very interesting.
When you work on a series, there's moments where something becomes clear aesthetically to you, and then you try to use that as a benchmark in a way to structure the work. this was one of those moments for me, this counterpoint. And I think we often make the mistake of thinking that our lives begin on the day that we're born. But actually, they begin much earlier than that, because we're born into circumstance, we're born into a context. And, when I was looking at this image of the man drunk and oblivious to the world, I was like wondering, and as I always do when I see that in a public place, what drives this person to, drink that much, to completely lose control and pass out when other people are happy to buy a few tacos and have a few beers and have a good time and laugh and celebrate? Why does this person have to go to those extremes? How far does the pain go? And then I see an image like the one on the left in the archive, and maybe 100 years earlier, that trauma came into his family, the people who came before him, and maybe he inherited some of that somehow. I don't know. It's mysterious. And, the fact that an archive can take me to the Dominican Republic or to Haiti or to Nicaragua at the beginning of the 20th century to try and help me figure out something that I think is necessary for me to understand is such a gift. And that's the reason why I'm interested in archives, because they're a kind of time machine to take you somewhere where you never were. And yeah, that was the process here. The book is 60 pages long, and there's maybe 50 or so images, but it took years to form itself. I was originally going to publish this book with Smithsonian Press, but I had to say no, because we were about ready to go to press, and all of a sudden they were insisting on having an appendix with detailed captions explaining the provenance of the images and annotating each image academically. And I was like, no, you guys, that's not the point. That was never the point. There is no academic justification for this. This is entirely an artistic intervention. I cannot justify calling the U.S. interventions in Central America war academically, and I cannot justify calling the Latino Festival peace in any way, shape, or form. So we're like going down the wrong road here. So I had to, it fell apart. I had to say no. And then a year went by and I couldn't even look at the work because I was just so chagrined. The chagrin of the whole thing, it left such a bad taste in my mouth. But then surely enough, I returned to it, and I built a new dummy for the project. I think a much better dummy, in collaboration with Studio Lin in New York, and then eventually found Meteoro Editions. That's how the book came to happen.
And then it ended up at Urbanatica. And then
even before it was a book, it was awarded by Urbanautico, for which I am incredibly grateful, because that kind of vote of confidence helps an artist. It helps you believe in the work. When an institute like Urbanautico takes it seriously, and it rubs off on you, it helps you build your confidence up. So thank you, Urbanautico.
Well, I am definitely inspired by them. So, and by that whole organization. So, we have time for one more project, and this is your latest body of work. And I want to make sure that we have enough time for this, because I really, really enjoyed this one. And we get back to your photography, and we get back to your documentary style. You call it a documentary style. Who works in the style of documentary, I should say that. But tell me a little bit about this project. Give me a little background. How did it start? And and so on?
I think looking back at my career, at my practice, every project has a different relationship to time. And every project, and this is something that Gil Perez actually taught me, every project has a shape. And you have to find that shape. And the key to finding the shape of the project for me is to understand what is the relationship of photography and time in that particular body of work. This project is about an 80-year-old blind magician who works the New York City subway for a living. And, I met him 20 years earlier, like hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers met him by chance on a subway car. And the man made such an impression, but it was almost impossible not to be impressed by him. I mean, I was sitting in the subway car and in comes this man wearing a tuxedo and a red cotton shirt, pushing a little cart, and he stops in the middle of the car and starts whistling. And then in about a couple minutes, couldn't have been more than a minute and a half, 2 minutes, he goes through this routine, which is exactly the kind of magic that I grew up with. And it is like a classic Latin American magician's routine. He does sleight of hand with colorful silk handkerchiefs, things that appear and disappear in midair. But then there's live animals in the New York City subway. And so, there's a dove that comes out of the silk handkerchief. It's like, everybody in the car is like, wow, what just happened? His finale, I remember, was this black velvet box, and he would show that it was empty, and then he would produce this beautiful, plump white rabbit, the heart beating really quickly in its chest, and show it around. And I was so moved. And I went up to him and, in Spanish, I thanked him for the show. I gave him a tip. And he didn't say anything, but he gave me his card. It said Olmedini El Mago. And I kept that card for 20 years. And one summer in 2018, I woke up thinking about the magician. I was like, I wonder what happened to that guy. I wonder if I still have that card. And I did still have the card. So I took it out and I dialed the number. And of course, the number was no longer in use. And I said to myself, I'm going to find this guy. So I started looking for him. It took me about 2 weeks to track him down. Like in one of the detective stories that we were talking about earlier. So I finally called him and he answered. I said, in Spanish, "Is this Olmedini El Mago?" And he waited 1 beat. He waited 2 beats. And then finally he said in a voice that sounded like a 1940s radio show, he goes, "At your service." It's like, okay.
In Espanol?
I said, you'll never remember me. What?
Did he say it in Spanish?
In Spanish, he said it, para servirle. Para servirle. And so I said, what? Respected magician. And I always say that to him, respected magician, from day one. You'll never remember me, but I remember you. And we met in the New York City subway, and I woke up thinking about you, and I just wanted, this was many years ago, probably 20 years ago, and I'm wondering how you are, and are you still working as a magician? And he said, well, I suffered a stroke about 10 years ago, and it left me blind in both eyes. And I said, how old are you? He said, 78. So in my head, I was like, okay, this guy's retired. I mean, it's a door that will never open. And then he said, but I'm still working the subway. And I just couldn't believe it. So we made an appointment. We met on the platform of an uptown bound train, and the train pulled in almost immediately. So I just jumped in the train with him and started shooting, and kept on shooting for 3 years until COVID brought everything down to a halt. But Olmedini was not just any magician. He was the most famous magician in Ecuador growing up. And he's had an incredibly colorful life. I couldn't begin to tell you the stories. There's so many stories. He was famous. He had his own TV show. He was a celebrity in his own right. He would come to New York City every so often just to have a good time, to go to the theater and take showgirls dancing and buy himself a few expensive suits and then go back to Ecuador. But on one of those trips, he decided to stay just on a whim. And he wanted to trade his local fame for international stardom. And it never panned out. He didn't speak English. No amount of money is enough for New York City. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You're going to run out of money sooner than later. And so he started trying to work his magic on the streets. And then it got cold and winter set in. And he had to go underground. And that's where I met him. And he stayed underground for 20-something years. And then we met again. And this body of work is a chronicle of his life as a blind magician. Let me show you some images.
Of course. And I have just a quick question. How long is his routine?
It's about a minute and a half. Because he has to...
Because you only have one stop, right? And so, yeah.
Exactly.
Wow.
You know it.
Yeah.
You know it. It's because he has to collect
Paris
donations.
Yeah.
I'm sure it plays out exactly. And there's a whole economy underground. It's a shadow city of the city above ground with its own rules and its own hierarchies. And in that sense, it's like all the other projects that interest me. It's about somebody living far from the mainstream by their own rules, and except in this case, it's just one guy. I was used to working in communities. I never worked one-on-one like this with somebody. I've taken more photographs of Olmedini than I've had of my wife or my children. I mean, he's the person I've photographed the most in my entire life. To give you a sense of how much he matters to me. And so I'll show you a few pictures just to get this started. Can you see it on screen?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. He makes a living in crumpled dollar bills, single bills. Wherever he goes, everybody's always looking, even though he himself is blind.
So
you can't really...
you're seeing a little bit of the live animal. Look at all these people.
Yeah, exactly. This is how you, photographically, how do you translate the fact that he's a good magician? Well, if you were shooting it on video, you could judge for yourself. But I found myself kind of looking at the audience over and over again to gauge their reactions, their feeling towards Olmedini. And now he speaks a little bit of English, so he doesn't have to whistle anymore. Although sometimes he does open his show with the opening bars of Beethoven's Fifth. Da-na-na-na. He walks into the subway and starts humming that to get people's attention. The New York Times published a number of images when we're about, I guess, around 4 months into the project. I sent an image to New York Times and a short 1-paragraph description and gave them first dibs. I said, this is the project. If you want to see more images, and go to my website, of course, password protected, and take a look. And they replied, yes, we will publish this work. And they did, and it ran in the Sunday edition, in the Metro section, and it ran on the web as well. And then things took a dramatic change. From one day to the next, you had broadcast channels from all over the world coming to New York City to do a feature, a story of a story, as I think you said that earlier in our conversation, a story of a story, not a story of the man, not a story of Olmedini the way I saw him and knew him, but just revisiting my story in the New York Times. And they even had like all of my pictures on their phone, and they would use that as a kind of script. What are we going to do today? Well, we have to get this shot. We have to get this shot. The most shameless of all was TV Globo from Brazil. I mean, those guys, and they have an audience of 70 million people for their show. Those guys actually asked me, how did you get this shot? I'm going to tell them, right? But I was so involved in this because nobody could find Olmedini, so everybody could find me very easily. I have a website. I'm a known quantity, but try and find Olmedini, it's difficult. So they would contact me instead. And I became, if you want, the agent to a blind magician, to an octogenarian blind magician. I would take all of his calls and then relay to him what they wanted. And then, I never took a penny for this, of course, but I would sometimes tag along behind the scenes because I wanted to see the way the media would represent them. Amazing things happen. At one point, I got a call from the New York Yankees, and it was incredible. They have an event called Hope Week every year where they honor 5 New Yorkers, and they said, we saw your photographs in the New York Times and we want to honor Olmedini. And they sent 7 pictures to surprise him at home. I actually told the magician, on this day, do not leave the house until I show up. Wait for me to come. And also, wear your finest suit and get a fresh haircut because it's going to be one of the best days of your life. And I didn't say anything else because I didn't want to spoil the surprise. So he came out, and the pictures were waiting for him. And of course, all the media was there. CNN, the Yes Network, Telemundo, so many camera crews. And they escorted him walking to the subway to take the subway to Yankee Stadium. And there he threw the ceremonial first pitch. It was an incredible day.
That image where he's looking out of the subway with the yellow light is it's a wonderful image. And he's blind, but you just captured a really magical moment. A man on his stage, the lights of his stage,
So true.
That's a magic. Yeah, this one image is the one that was like, we have to talk about this one, because I just felt it almost instantly. And you do have an image of the baseball moment. In the series.
We won't have time today, but of course, people can go to the website and see an extended edit of what happened at the Yankee Stadium. But this image is also, you brought up an incredibly important image to me, because this is at the end of the day, and it takes a lot out of anybody to ride the subway for 8 hours. And if you're performing in the heat of summer with a jacket on, in that heat, I mean, it's killer. But Olmedini is a force of nature, and this is when he was 78. Right now, he's 82. This is the very end of the day, and he's looking completely exhausted. Also, this is from the very beginning of our collaboration, and if you look at his hair, it's overgrown, and he's not the way he will be a few weeks later. When he understood that I was going to continue photographing him and that I really, really saw him, his whole demeanor started to change. He always had a fresh haircut whenever we saw each other. Even though he was living in public housing, he would find a way to get his nails manicured. He's a sharp dresser. But as soon as somebody believed in him again, it changed him. And, this was a fascinating process to me because he always wanted the big stage. He always wanted to be a legend. And when we got to Yankee Stadium and he had that chance in front of 40,000 people, he was a pro and he was the consummate performer. And I was like, okay, this is the moment of truth.
Wow.
And it really happened. And after that, there were other things. There's a magazine called G9 Magazine that is the Bible of the magic world. And all of his career, he just wanted to be mentioned by name in a sentence. After Yankee Stadium, G9 called and they wanted to do just a short vignette on Olmedini, a couple paragraphs in a picture. So they asked me for a picture, and then they wanted me to put him in touch with him. And they did, and they published that, and he was over the moon. But a few months later, they called again, and they wanted the cover for Olmedini and 14 pages inside. And, this was like a kind of late night renaissance for him. And it's very difficult. I mean, if you're doing a documentary project, your photographs should not change the outcome of the story. They should not interfere with the story. But in this case, and that's part of the difficulty of sequencing the work and making a book out of it, it's incredibly complicated because the photographs catapult Olmedini to a different place, right? After being invisible for 20 years, all of a sudden he is headlining America's biggest magic festival. He's on the New York Times, etc. He throws the ceremonial first pitch at the Yankee Stadium. So that's the arc of the story, and then COVID wipes everything away.
That is a story.
COVID takes the rug under
we don't have enough time left, and I'm sure you could tell me so much more. But I do have one. I just have a few more questions for you. And if anybody else wants to check out the rest of this, go to Jaime's page. He's got lots of great work on that page, and this is just one of his exceptional series. And I will say this: there's a magic about this when you tell this story. I think it reminds me of I'm drawing a connection to my own, because that's where we always come from, is our own particular perspective. But there are these moments in your life that you toss and turn in bed, and there's just this idea in your head. One of those was this podcast. I have no idea where this is going to go, but
good place.
What's that? Yeah. Well, but what you said there was, just out of nowhere, Olmedini. I wonder what's happening to this guy. And yeah, you had no idea what that inspiration was going to do. It brought you there. You kind of started to give focus on him, and you had a reverence for him, which I really, really appreciate. And
right.
And that showing someone that they're seen elevated him to the spot that he had always dreamed of. And you hear a story like that, and you can't help but just think, everything happens for a reason. And that is just fascinating. That is just wow. And you got a front seat to it.
I mean, it was really life-changing for me as well, Patrick. I have to say, I feel lucky that we were able to do this work together. My favorite book, and we were talking about books earlier in the podcast, my single favorite book is Don Quixote de la Mancha. It's always been my favorite book. And in Olmedini, I felt like I found a 21st century Don Quixote, deep underground.
Yeah.
Well, the man living the impossible dream, the incurable romantic, force of nature.
Yeah.
Somebody, look, if it was me and I was 81 years old and COVID shut me down and I had to spend a year and a half on my own line in public housing with only a social worker to look in on me and help me out, I would have died. I would have just shriveled up and died, man. I mean, it's like the only company he has are those birds, those doves. Lluvia and Sol, rain and sun are the names of the doves. Otherwise, he's completely alone. And he survived.
Wow.
And he didn't lose his mind, and he didn't lose his health. I mean, what a fighter. What a force of nature.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's that dream, it's those, I can just see his imagination, just seeing himself with those big spotlights on you on the stage doing what he was meant to do. That's a heck of a story. We're going to have to finish there. But I just have one last question for you. It's one that I ask everyone in these shows is, there's a lot of people that are following this show that are image makers themselves and people that are trying to, make their way in art and maybe in photography in general. Do you have any advice for anybody as far as how to make your way and what do you have any advice for those people?
Absolutely. I would say when something inside of you is pointing you in a direction, listen to that voice. Whatever it is, if it belongs to you, if it's urgent, if it's necessary for you to explore, take a leap of faith and explore. And also, I would say commit to exploring. So as busy as you might be, give it 1 day a week at least to start off. Decide that there is 1 day a week that is not for your lover, that is not for your family, that is not for your work, how you make a living in the world. It's a day for your photography. And, hold yourself to it. You'll be amazed how much work you can make if you commit 1 day a week to making work. And it might be more than that. It might become 2 days a week, might become 3 days a week. You might even have the curse of becoming a photographer for real. And
the curse,
ranged idea that
doesn't leave you.
Living at.
Yeah.
Yeah, that might be your misfortune if someday you decide to put all of your eggs in that basket. But that's my advice is you gotta trust your intuition, your identity, trust that voice, and then honor it by actually committing to doing the work, no matter what. It doesn't have to be the same day every week, but 1 day a week, put everything on hold and just do your thing. I think people who are struggling for so many different reasons. I've gone through different stages. At one point, I wouldn't pick up my camera unless somebody had given me a grant or I had money coming in to do the project. That's bullshit, That's not how you do the work. Expecting a check before you dust off the camera. So, there's no science, there's no manual for this, no guidebook, but it's worked for me so far. And there's only a limited number of projects we can do in a lifetime, right? So we got to find something that matters for the right reasons.
Wow. I think that's great advice. And we'll just wrap it up with how can people find you? And are you on social media? This is
I'm on Instagram.
How they can connect with you and follow you. So Instagram, okay.
Instagram, I have a website. I would say those two are probably the easiest ways to reach out to me. You can email me from my website or you can visit Instagram. Instagram is different than a website. There's a mix of things. I more frustrated than enjoying Instagram because I hate seeing my pictures on a phone screen, really, really tiny. But it's a tool as well. It's a way of being out there, and it's certainly a way to connect with people. I've made some really good friendships over Instagram, and I think that's the greater value of the whole thing for me, is that I've met some interesting photographers and artists on the platform. And so, yeah, reach out. I'd be happy to hear from you.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Really, it was a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me. And even though it's not an open forum, I welcome anybody who came along for the journey.
Yeah. And to everyone that's made it this far, thank you so much for joining us today. And if you like content like this, please consider liking, sharing, and commenting down below. That helps us with the algorithms. And also, if you want to support content like this, join our patreon.com page and become a member. And as always, we'll see you next time.